Francis J. Hall's Anglican Dogmatics, Book 1, Chapter 7, Provincialism. Part 1, Anglican Authority. Section 1. There is a provincialism which means insularity and which involves inevitable narrowness of mind and poverty in practice. But every Catholic Christian, and therefore every Catholic theologian, is under obligation to exhibit cheerful loyalty to the provincial authority under which God has placed him, and to keep an edifying touch with the faithful and the local conditions of his own portion of the Catholic Church. He has obligations toward his immediate co-religionists, which he cannot satisfy if he holds himself aloof, as it were, from their religious thoughts and life. The chief virtue of Christian life is charity, and this should begin at home. Again, genuine charity involves the grace of sympathy, and this requires real touch with the conditions of those about us. In short, there is a kind of provincialism which is not the fruit of narrowness at all, but of wholehearted acceptance of one's particular vocation and place in the Lord's vineyard. The provincialism needs consideration. In order that we may understand how to combine provincial loyalty with ecumenical breadth and Catholic temper, and that without inconsistency, how, in particular, to be a Catholic theologian and, at the same time, a loyal Anglican. Section 2. The obligation of a theologian to his own provincial obedience is twofold. In the first place, it is his duty to render ungrudging obedience in all things lawful to the ecclesiastical authority to which he is immediately subject. The Catholic Church exercises her authority over him, in fact, through provincial and diocesan channels. Presumptively and normally, the authority of the hierarchy and canon law of his own province and diocese is for him the authority of the Church universal. Thus, if the Anglican hierarchy is indeed a Catholic hierarchy and lawfully set over us, we cannot be good Catholics unless we are good Anglicans. This is said necessarily under one limitation. All Catholic authority is based upon and limited by the essential faith and order of the Catholic Church, so that no particular portion of the Church may lawfully impose what is in evident conflict therewith. But such conflict must be shown to exist beyond reasonable doubt, before one may rightly hesitate to render canonical obedience. In the second place, a theologian ought to accomplish his work in a manner suited to those conditions which actually prevail among the faithful of his own God-given constituency. It is this vocation of an Anglican theologian to labor for the edification of Anglicans, and this means that he must adjust his modes of expression and his practices as well to the lines of thought and practice which Anglicans are able to lay hold of, in view of their provincial and hereditary circumstances and limitations. This holds good in spite of the need that he should preserve an ecumenical breadth and point of view. In short, to accommodate oneself in good faith to providential circumstances and to the particular mission involved in them is an essential part of Catholic obedience. Section 3. The writer believes sincerely that the Anglican hierarchy is truly Catholic, that it has retained the essentials of Catholic faith and order, and that it is entitled by divine appointment and providential circumstances to his canonical obedience and steadfast loyalty. He believes further that this obligation of obedience and loyalty rests upon all, whether clerical or lay, learned or ignorant, whose providential birth and training has made them Anglicans. The particulars of such obligations should be studied carefully. The submission to authority which is involved is both doctrinal and practical. Happily, such submission includes, according to the express language of our formularies, an acceptance of the creeds and ecumenical councils of the undivided Catholic Church. Moreover, the formal principle of the Anglican Reformation is an appeal to antiquity, or to that teaching which has prevailed in the universal Church from primitive days. It follows that Anglicans are committed to whatsoever can be shown to be included in such teaching, whether defined in ecumenical formularies or not. Anglicans are also under an obligation of loyalty to the peculiar formularies of their own communion, it always being assumed that they do not demonstrably contradict the faith of the universal Church. Thus, the doctrines inculcated and implied in the Book of Common Prayer, as well as those contained in the Articles of Religion, ought to be adhered to, whether formal subscription to them is required or not. It is clearly inconsistent with any adequate notion of Anglican loyalty to dispute or reject such teachings, and loyalty pertains to all the faithful, whether clerical or lay. The clergy, as appointed to teach, and as presumably capable of making intelligently an explicit and theological profession of belief, are required in various ways to engage solemnly that they will conform to the doctrine of that portion of the Church in which they minister. The condition has been here recognized that the teachings of a particular church must not be inconsistent with the faith of the universal Church. Fortunately, the Anglican Communion accepted this principle at the time of the Reformation in unmistakable ways, and, in spite of the vagaries of parties and schools, has never forsaken it. We are bound, therefore, in the absence of certain proof to the contrary, to interpret Anglican formularies as intended to be consistent with Catholic doctrine. Section 4. Phrases can be found in both the Prayer Book and the Articles of Religion which are either obscure or ambiguous, and they have been taken by many in anti-Catholic senses. The position here taken is that they are not rightly interpreted thus, and that their obscurity is due to a cause which leaves us free to regard a Catholic interpretation as the true and legitimate one. It is well established that the Articles of Religion were imposed as an irenicon, rather than as a confession of faith in the usual sense of that phrase. Their purpose was defined in their title as the avoiding of the diversities of opinions, and for the establishing of consent touching true religion. The conditions which gave them birth were exceedingly critical and unfavorable to the imposition of precise definitions. Much error, no doubt, prevailed, but the pressing danger of the hour did not take the form of well-defined and coherent heresy, such as might be shut out by the deliberate and precise definitions of doctrine. But the difficulty to be met was a violent controversy, touching many matters of unequal importance, which seemed likely to destroy the Church of England if not speedily quieted. Some of the questions at issue were of a speculative nature, admitting therefore of no dogmatic settlement. Other differences existed which bore directly on the acceptance or rejection of Catholic doctrine, and under different circumstances they could have been dealt with by means of precise and exclusive statements. But much confusion prevailed, and the authorities judged, whether wisely or no, that the interests both of peace and orthodoxy could be secured by the imposition of general statements, thought to be capable of acceptance by Marians and Protestants alike, and by an insistence upon uniformity in worship. This policy was dictated by political as well as religious considerations. Queen Elizabeth herself pushed it through, and we know that she hoped to retain the Marians in the English Church, in spite of their attachment to Romish teachings. The 39 Articles are, therefore, essentially articles of peace. They cannot, in view of the policy which determined their final shape, be regarded rightly as intended to innovate upon the traditional faith of the Church of England. They were designed to shelve controversies which seemed to be incapable of more satisfactory treatment. It remains that the Articles open with a clear and unambiguous reaffirmation of the primary doctrines of the faith, as contained in the creeds and decrees of the undisputed general councils. And, even in the more vague articles, care was taken to avoid committing the Church to the errors then chiefly prevalent of popular medievalism, Calvinism, Zwinglianism, and Anabaptism. It may be acknowledged that terms and phrases may be found in certain of the articles which betray a desire not to force an issue with Calvinists. But that the articles are really Calvinistic can be disproved by a close scrutiny of these phrases, which are carefully purged of assertions particular to Calvinism. It can also be proved by the subsequent attitude of Calvinists toward the articles. They were dissatisfied with them, and tried without success to secure their modification. The Westminster Confession was the outcome of their discontent. The Royal Declaration of 1628, requiring that the articles should be taken strictly in their grammatical sense, was generally taken as working against Calvinistic interpretations. The notion that such interpretations were right was of later date, and was the result of the prevalence of evangelicalism. It did not gain footing until the memory of the original design of the articles had been forgotten. In time, however, the articles had come to be interpreted by the multitude in the light of 18th century evangelical traditions. It was the predominance of these traditions that made the interpretations set forth by Newman in Tract 90 seem non-natural and disingenuous. The fact is that Newman reverted to the earlier and strictly grammatical meaning of the articles, the only meaning that may be considered in legislative documents as binding. It cannot truly be denied that the more closely the language of the articles is examined, the more satisfactory and sound its proper meaning appears. The conclusion of the matter is that an acceptance of the 39 Articles in their original, official, and grammatical meaning is consistent with a full and hearty acceptance of the Catholic faith and religion. No doubt those who look for precise and determinative language on controversial points will be disappointed. An Irenicon is not likely to please those who desire clear definitions, and when the circumstances of its origin have passed away, its terms become obscure and try the patience of many. Happily, no Anglican is obliged to regard the phraseology of the Articles as in every respect admirable. It is enough to recognize their official purpose and to perceive that a Catholic interpretation of them is in line with that purpose and also with their grammatical sense. Chapter 2. Anglican Conditions. Section 5. The loyalty of an Anglican theologian to his portion of the Catholic Church includes a practical recognition of the peculiar conditions prevalent among Anglicans, and of the obligation he is under to edify the faithful in his own portion of the Catholic Church. The providential mission of the Anglican churches since the birth of Anglican descent is unique in the history of the Church. It determines to a degree the temper which they must exhibit, and limits official language in various ways. This mission is to recover to the Catholic faith and order the spiritual descendants of those who revolted altogether from ecclesiastical authority in an unbalanced reaction from medieval corruptions and abuses. Those who have inherited the position of descent misconceive much Catholic doctrine, confusing it with the caricatures which caused the birth of dissent. They misconceive both the nature and the grounds of the Church's authority in doctrines and discipline, and need to be approached in a charitable spirit and with carefully regarded speech if they are to be won from ignorance and dissent to an intelligent and Catholic unity. Moreover, the number of dissenters is very large. They surround us in every direction, coming into close social contact with churchmen, and influencing their minds in many ways. Many churchmen, therefore, are infected with the limitations of the dissenting mind, and labor under ignorant prejudice against principles truly Catholic, but which are thought to be peculiarly Romish. One of the practical purposes of Anglican theology should be to enable our clergy to reach the understandings of this multitude without becoming infected with error or one-sidedness. Such a purpose has dominated the best Anglican writers, but they have not always been able to avoid the one-sidedness to which they have adjusted themselves. They have often shown more anxiety to differentiate their theology from Roman theology than to exhibit Catholic doctrine in positive terms. Thus, much Anglican phraseology seems halting, inconsistent, and unsatisfactory. In many instances, patient study will exonerate our writers from the suspicion of real error, but their writings are often too polemical towards Rome and too apologetic towards dissenters to have much value in the domain of systematic theology. This is no doubt unfortunate, but the reasons which account for it should protect these writers from hasty condemnation and captious criticism. The patient reader will discover that Anglican theology is by no means so impoverished as it seems on the surface, and that our writers have done much to enrich as well as defend Catholic theology. Section 6. Anglican conditions and the peculiar mission of the Anglican hierarchy have led incidentally to a relaxation of ecclesiastical discipline. So far as this relaxation has had deliberate motive, it has been largely due to a desire not to quench a smoking flax, but to retain those who have felt impatient because of what they deemed to be the inadequacy of the Anglican Reformation. An unprecedented liberty of opinion and speech touching the Church's official teaching has been the outcome of this policy. The so-called high, low, and broad church parties exhibit divergences of doctrine and practice which are more radical and mutually antagonistic than are allowed to be expressed openly in other portions of the Catholic Church. Different theological schools, such, for example, as the Thomist and Scotist, have appeared elsewhere, but their divergences have been confined, at least in their open expression and ecclesiastical toleration, to speculative questions. Anglican parties differ openly on fundamental questions, while professing allegiance to formularies and usages which ought in time to make for unity and a more adequate acceptance of the Catholic faith and religion. We cannot accept the position of any one of these parties, at least in its partisan aspect, as adequate. But without undertaking any full discussion of their peculiar principles, we have to recognize the fact that these parties exist, and cannot any one of them be excluded from the Anglican communion. The theologian should take cognizance of them, while endeavoring as far as possible to escape their limitations. He should seek to discover the positive truths and Catholic principles which are retained by each party, in spite of the one-sided manner in which these truths and principles are often presented. He should do this in order not to overlook the points wherein all are at one, and in order to adjust his language to existing conditions. He should avoid, as far as may be, the use of partisan shibboleths, and seek to build upon what all accept a theology which will supply most persuasively and reasonably what is lacking in partisan views. He may not, of course, sacrifice any portion of the Catholic faith, but must aim to absorb the defective conceptions prevailing among many Anglicans into a full-orbed Catholic theology expressed in terms which Anglicans can most readily understand, but not so expressed as to complicate the problem of Catholic unity. His temper must be sympathetic and ironical on the one hand, and unbending in loyalty to the faith and practice of the universal Church on the other hand. Section 7. To bring all these considerations to their practical issue, the Anglican theologian has need to observe the following rules. A. The norm of all theological explication should be the ecumenical language of the Catholic creeds and the undisputed general councils. This rule is indispensable for the preservation of an ecumenical outlook and for loyalty to the highest dogmatic authority on earth. It is also necessary to be observed in the interest of the future reunion of Christendom. B. Terms which, without being ecumenical in a formal sense, are of a general acceptance and use in the Catholic Church, may not safely be repudiated. For instance, a wise theologian will not deny that confirmation, penance, orders, matrimony, and unction are sacraments or mysteries. He is justified on ecumenical as well as Anglican grounds in refusing to put them on the same level with baptism and the Lord's Supper. The whole Church agrees that these alone are generally necessary for salvation, and that no other sacraments have their visible signs, sacramenta, laid down in the Gospels. The theologians may no doubt rightly exercise at times judicious reserve with regard to such terms, since they are not, as terms, imposed upon the faithful. The point is that, by simply repudiating them, he runs inevitable risk of seeming to repudiate the truths connoted by them. Thus, to repudiate the term sacrament altogether in connection with the lesser sacraments, commonly called by that name, it is likely to be understood as a denial that they are divinely sanctioned instruments for conferring sanctifying grace. This is what, in general, is signified by the term. C. An Anglican is at liberty to avoid terms of any mere school of theology or of another and merely provincial portion of the Church, provided he does so in a manner which does not prejudice Catholic doctrines associated therewith. He may even find it desirable to do this in particular instances, by reason of the misleading connotations which the terms rejected have for Anglicans. Thus the term transubstantiation is rightly used with hesitation and caution, because although used widely to signify merely the revealed truth that the Eucharistic bread and wine are made to be the body and blood of Christ in a mystery by their consecration, it has come to stand among Anglicans either for a physical and destructive change of the elements, or for a philosophical explanation of the mystery. But a rejection of this term, so widely used elsewhere in the Church, should be accompanied by positive assertion of the truth expressed in our Lord's words, "This is my body," etc. In this connection, caution should be exercised in the use of terms not usually employed or rightly understood by Anglicans. The practice of copying indiscriminately the terminology of a foreign theology is to be avoided, especially as the English language is rich and precise enough to express every necessary element of Catholic truth without such deference to foreign schools. This does not mean that no foreign terms should be taken over under any circumstances. If and when our theology can really be improved by such means, we shall do well to borrow terms and phrases from other portions of the Catholic Church. And it is not to be forgotten that the interests of ecumenical outlook and unity require us to keep in reasonable touch with the theological developments of the Catholic Church beyond our borders. The point to be maintained is that we ought not to get out of touch with Anglican thought or fall into foreign provincialisms in our anxiety to avoid Anglican provincialisms. D. An Anglican theologian should be careful to do justice to the terms employed in Anglican formularies. This means that he should not repudiate them because many use them in defective senses, but should emphasize their Catholic meaning. The necessity of such procedure should be evident. We are bound to take the formularies of our own ecclesiastical authority in that sense which justifies our recognition of this Church as a Catholic body, and as sharing in the teaching office of the universal Church. This cannot easily be done if we openly disparage or neglect her language. Moreover, faithful Anglicans generally must, insofar as they are faithful, defer loyally to the official language of their own portion of the Church. Our only means, therefore, of fortifying them in Catholic doctrine is to use Anglican phrases freely in Catholic senses. Happily, this involves no deceit or unnatural use of terms. It involves simply that we should extricate these phrases from the anti-Catholic senses, which post-Reformation controversies have caused to be read into some of them. Taken historically and strictly, our formularies are not un-Catholic. The worst that can be truly said is that, in certain instances, a desire to shelve dangerous questions has caused the use of terms and phrases which require patient analysis and some knowledge of history for their correct and Catholic interpretation. E. Finally, Anglican theologians should be careful to avoid an exaggerated estimate of the divergences between the different schools of theology tolerated in our midst. There can be no question as to the existence of seemingly defective views among the members of certain schools. Much language is used by them, which seems hard to reconcile without any adequate hold upon the Catholic faith and religion. On the other hand, language is used in some quarters which seem to many loyal churchmen to caricature the truth instead of exhibiting in it just proportion. To give examples in either direction seems undesirable and invidious. But, on the one hand, allowance should be made for the desire to exclude superstition into dogmatism which exceeds what is warranted by Scripture and the faith of the universal Church. On the other hand, we must remember that a movement in the interests of neglected truth is inevitably accompanied by exaggeration. We believe that if the partisans to whom we refer would take pains to understand each other, they would discover that, in spite of their diverse points of view, their implicit faith contains larger elements of agreement than is usually acknowledged by them. We do not, of course, deny that real differences exist, but we are convinced that the majority of these differences are more likely to be remedied by generous emulation in devotion to the working system of the Book of Common Prayer than by mutual recriminations. At all events, an exaggerated view of divergences cannot make for the interests of truth, and is fatal to the highest success in the theological sphere.